What the Buddha predicted about the decline of the Dharma. There is a particular sadness that does not arrive as grief, but as a quiet recognition that something meaningful can be lost without anyone noticing the exact moment it began to fade. It is the feeling one has when returning to a familiar place years later and realizing that the atmosphere has changed, not through destruction but through neglect, distraction, and the slow accumulation of small compromises. This kind of loss does not announce itself with noise. It moves gently, almost politely, asking very little of our attention, and because of that, it is often misunderstood until it has already taken root. The Buddha spoke of decline in this way, not as a dramatic collapse of truth, but as a gradual thinning of clarity. He did not describe the Dharma as something that would suddenly vanish or be defeated by external forces. Instead, he observed that teachings rooted in direct experience depend entirely on the quality of human attention that sustains them. When attention weakens, when practice becomes secondary to identity, when comfort quietly replaces inquiry, the Dharma does not disappear, but it becomes faint, like a fire still warm beneath ashes. This understanding can be unsettling because it shifts responsibility away from history and onto human behavior. It suggests that the decline of wisdom is not caused by time itself, but by how people live within time. The Dharma, in this sense, is not a possession passed down intact through generations. It is a living orientation of the mind, renewed each time someone looks honestly at suffering, desire, and impermanence without turning away. When that looking becomes rare, the teachings remain, but their power to transform grows thin. To speak about the decline of the Dharma, then, is not to predict an ending, but to reflect on a pattern that repeats wherever human beings gather around truth. It is an invitation to look carefully at how sincerity erodes, how meaning becomes routine, and how liberation can quietly be replaced by explanation. The Buddha's reflections were never meant to inspire fear about the future. They were meant to sharpen awareness in the present, where decline and renewal are always unfolding side by side. When the Buddha spoke about the decline of the Dharma, he did so from an intimate understanding of human psychology rather than from concern about time or fate. He had seen clearly that truth does not erode because it becomes false, but because the conditions that allow it to be lived gradually weaken. The Dharma, as he understood it, was never merely a set of words or ideas. It was a way of seeing that required effort, honesty, and a willingness to remain uncomfortable in the presence of reality. When those qualities diminish, the teachings remain available, but they lose their depth, becoming easier to admire than to embody. One of the earliest signs of decline, he observed, was not moral failure or intellectual confusion, but subtle complacency. When people first encounter a teaching that speaks directly to their suffering, there is often a sense of urgency and humility. The mind listens carefully because it feels exposed. Over time, however, familiarity sets in. The words are heard again and again, and gradually they lose their sharpness. What once challenged the self begins to coexist comfortably with it. Practice becomes something one has rather than something one does. In this way, the Dharma is not rejected, it is domesticated. The Buddha understood that communities built around insight are especially vulnerable to this kind of soft erosion. When teachings gather followers, structures form naturally to support learning and continuity. These structures are not harmful in themselves, but they carry a risk. Roles emerge, reputations develop, and authority becomes attached to identity. Slowly, attention shifts from the work of liberation to the maintenance of belonging. The question moves from "Am I seeing clearly?" to "Am I recognized?" This shift is almost invisible to those within it because it does not feel like corruption. It feels like stability. Another element the Buddha pointed to was the replacement of direct experience with second-hand understanding. In the beginning, The Dharma is encountered as something alive, something that must be tested against one's own fear, craving and confusion. But as teachings are preserved, categorized and explained, there is a temptation to substitute knowledge for insight. One can speak fluently about impermanence while quietly resisting it in one's own life. One can analyze suffering while avoiding the places where it actually lives. The Dharma then becomes something that describes reality rather than something that transforms how reality is met. The Buddha did not criticize learning or reflection. He recognized their necessity. What he warned against was the subtle pride that can arise when understanding becomes detached from practice. When people begin to identify with their familiarity with the teachings, inquiry slows. The mind no longer listens as if something essential is at stake. Instead, it listens to confirm what it already knows. In such a climate, the Dharma still sounds correct, but it no longer penetrates. It circulates above the surface of life, admired but untested. Ethical discipline was another area where decline quietly takes root. In the early days of sincere practice, ethical restraint is not experienced as a rule imposed from outside, but as a natural sensitivity to the consequences of one's action. Over time, however, ethical conduct can become performative. It becomes something one displays rather than something one feels. When this happens, the heart grows less responsive. Harm is avoided not because it is clearly seen, but because it is prohibited. Compassion becomes an obligation rather than a response. This shift dulls awareness, even while behavior appears correct. The Buddha also spoke of the danger of attachment to form, meaning the tendency to cling to external expressions of the teaching while losing touch with its inner purpose. Rituals, symbols, and language can support practice, but they can also replace it. When people mistake repetition for realization, the Dharma begins to function as reassurance rather than awakening. It soothes anxiety without addressing its roots. It offers identity instead of freedom. In this way, decline occurs not through opposition, but through comfort. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of decline to recognize is that it often arrives wearing the appearance of devotion. People may speak passionately about preserving the Dharma while neglecting the qualities that allow it to remain alive. They may defend interpretations while avoiding self-examination. They may argue about meaning while overlooking suffering. The Buddha saw that when attachment enters spiritual life, it rarely announces itself honestly. It hides behind sincerity, making it harder to question. Underlying all of these patterns is a gradual loss of attention. The Buddha understood attention not as concentration alone, but as the willingness to stay present with what is unfolding, especially when it challenges one's sense of self. When attention becomes scattered or selective, when it avoids discomfort and seeks confirmation, the Dharma loses its cutting edge. It becomes something one believes rather than something one lives. This, more than any external threat, is what the Buddha identified as the true condition for decline. Yet even in these observations, there was no trace of despair. The Buddha did not speak of decline as an irreversible slide into darkness. He spoke of it as a tendency always dependent on conditions. Just as clarity can fade, it can also return. But it cannot be preserved through force or fear. It can only be renewed through honest engagement with experience. The Buddha's reflections were meant to cultivate this honesty, not to inspire anxiety about the future. In this way, the prediction of decline was itself an act of compassion. It was a reminder that the Dharma is not protected by reverence alone, but by attention, humility, and continuous practice. It was an invitation to notice the early signs of forgetting, not in institutions or traditions, but in the subtle movements of one's own mind. The decline of the Dharma, as the Buddha understood it, always begins there, long before it becomes visible anywhere else. When the Buddha's reflections on decline are brought into the context of modern life, They feel less like ancient prophecy and more like a quiet description of conditions that surround us every day. The world now moves with a speed and density of stimulation that would have been unimaginable in his time, yet the underlying patterns of the human mind remain unchanged. Desire still seeks distraction, fear still avoids uncertainty, and the sense of self still looks for reassurance. In such an environment, the Dharma does not vanish, but it competes constantly with forces that reward restlessness and superficial certainty. One of the clearest parallels lies in how attention is shaped. The Buddha emphasized sustained, patient awareness as the ground of insight, but modern life trains attention to fragment itself. Information arrives in endless streams, each demanding only a moment of focus before giving way to the next. This way of engaging with experience subtly conditions the mind to skim rather than to dwell. When the Dharma is encountered within this pattern, it is often consumed as another piece of content. Teachings are sampled, shared, and discussed, but rarely allowed to settle deeply enough to disturb ingrained habits. This creates a form of spiritual familiarity without transformation. People may feel close to the Dharma because they recognize its language or agree with its values, yet their relationship to suffering remains largely unchanged. The Buddha warned that this kind of closeness can be misleading. When teachings become part of one's intellectual or cultural identity, they lose their ability to question that identity. The mind feels informed, even inspired, while remaining fundamentally untouched. In this sense, the decline of the Dharma is not a loss of access, but a loss of intimacy. Another condition the Buddha implicitly pointed toward is the human tendency to seek certainty in belief, rather than clarity in experience. In uncertain times, spiritual teachings are often approached as sources of comfort or explanation. While there is nothing wrong with seeking solace, the danger arises when comfort becomes the primary goal. The Dharma then risks being reshaped to affirm existing views, soothe anxiety, or provide moral reassurance. Its role shifts from revealing the nature of suffering to managing it. This subtle change transforms a path of insight into a system of psychological support, valuable in some ways, but far from what the Buddha intended. The modern emphasis on self-improvement can also obscure the heart of the Dharma. The Buddha's teaching was never about perfecting the self, but about seeing through the assumption that a fixed self exists. In contemporary culture, however, spiritual practice is often framed as a way to enhance performance, happiness, or resilience. Mindfulness becomes a tool for productivity. Compassion becomes a strategy for emotional balance. While these applications are not inherently harmful, they can quietly shift the focus away from liberation toward optimization. The Dharma becomes something that serves the self rather than something that questions it. This shift mirrors precisely the pattern the Buddha associated with decline. When practice is valued primarily for what it delivers, the willingness to face discomfort diminishes. The aspects of the teaching that challenge craving, expose fear, or unsettle identity are softened or ignored. What remains is a version of the Dharma that fits neatly into existing lives without requiring fundamental change. It is easier to integrate, but also easier to forget at the level that matters most. The Buddha also understood that community, while essential, can reinforce these tendencies when reflection is replaced by consensus. In modern contexts, spiritual communities often form around shared language and values, both online and in person. These spaces can offer support and inspiration, but they can also create echo chambers. When questioning gives way to affirmation, and doubt is seen as weakness rather than inquiry, the Dharma loses its essence. It becomes something that binds people together, rather than something that frees them. There is also the issue of time. The Buddha emphasized patience and continuity of practice, recognizing that insight unfolds gradually. Modern life, however, is structured around immediacy. Results are expected quickly, Progress is measured visibly. When these expectations are applied to the Dharma, frustration arises. If deep understanding does not appear on schedule, interest wanes. Practice is abandoned or replaced. The teaching is then judged by its ability to produce experiences rather than by its capacity to transform understanding over time. This impatience accelerates the conditions of decline, even among sincere practitioners. Perhaps the most subtle modern parallel lies in the commodification of spirituality. The Dharma is now widely available, translated, packaged, and marketed in countless forms. Accessibility can be a gift, but it also carries risk. When teachings are treated as products, they are shaped by demand. Simplicity is favored over depth, affirmation over challenge. The Buddha understood that when truth is adjusted to remain appealing, it gradually loses its power to awaken. It becomes something to be consumed rather than something to be lived. And yet, it is important to recognize that the Buddha did not view these conditions as signs of inevitable failure. He understood them as expressions of human nature interacting with changing circumstances. The same conditions that foster decline also make renewal possible. Where distraction is strong, the clarity of sustained attention becomes more radical. Where spiritual language is common, genuine silence becomes more meaningful. The Dharma does not require a perfect environment to survive. It requires individuals willing to meet experience honestly, even when doing so runs against the prevailing current. In this light, the Buddha's reflections on decline function less as a warning about history and more as a mirror for the present. They invite a gentle but uncompromising examination of how one engages with the teaching, not to judge or correct others, but to notice the subtle ways comfort, identity, and habit shape one's own practice. The question is not whether the Dharma is declining somewhere in the world, but whether it is being lived with clarity here, in this mind, in this moment. Even as the Buddha spoke about the conditions that lead to decline, he never separated them from the conditions that allow the Dharma to endure. This is often overlooked because the human mind tends to focus on loss more readily than on continuity. Yet for the Buddha, decline and renewal were never opposing forces. They were intertwined movements, both arising from the same source: how attention is used and how experience is met. Where carelessness appears, clarity fades. Where care is restored, clarity returns. There is no fixed era in which the Dharma is entirely lost or entirely secure. The Buddha understood that the Dharma does not survive primarily through institutions, texts, or public recognition, though these can support it. It survives through lived understanding, often quietly, sometimes invisibly. Even in times when teachings are misunderstood or diluted, there are individuals who encounter suffering directly and feel compelled to look deeper rather than to turn away. In such moments, the Dharma is reborn, not as a revival of forms, but as insight arising in the present. This renewal does not announce itself. It does not need validation. It simply works, reducing confusion and easing suffering where it is practiced. One of the most important elements of continuity the Buddha pointed to was humility. The Dharma weakens when people assume they already understand it. It remains alive when understanding is held lightly. Humility allows practice to remain responsive rather than rigid. It keeps inquiry open. In periods described as decline, humility becomes especially rare and therefore especially powerful. A single person willing to admit uncertainty and to look honestly at their own mind can embody the Dharma more fully than a community confident in its interpretation. The Buddha also emphasized that genuine practice tends to move toward simplicity over time. As teachings are clarified, what remains essential becomes increasingly apparent. This simplicity does not mean lack of depth. It means freedom from unnecessary complication. In times of decline, when spiritual life becomes crowded with concepts, methods, and identities, Simplicity acts as a corrective. Returning to the basics of ethical sensitivity, mindful awareness and clear seeing does not require permission or recognition. It can happen anywhere, under any condition. Another quiet source of renewal lies in suffering itself. The Buddha never viewed suffering as an obstacle to the Dharma, but as its point of entry. In eras of comfort, practice can become theoretical. In times of instability, loss or uncertainty, the questions the Dharma addresses become unavoidable. When people are brought face to face with impermanence, teachings that speak honestly about it regain their relevance. In this way, what appears as decline at the level of culture can coincide with awakening at the level of individuals. The Buddha also recognized that the Dharma adapts without losing its essence. Language changes, forms evolve, contexts shift. Decline occurs not when adaptation happens, but when adaptation loses contact with direct experience. Renewal, therefore, does not require returning to the past or preserving teachings in their original shape. It requires preserving their function. If a teaching still helps someone see craving, fear, and impermanence more clearly, it remains Dharma regardless of how it is expressed. Importantly, the Buddha did not place responsibility for the future of the Dharma on collective effort alone. He consistently brought attention back to individual practice. Large-scale preservation can fail. Institutions can weaken. Traditions can fracture, yet none of this prevents a single mind from seeing clearly. The Dharma is not a resource that can be depleted by use. It is a capacity that becomes stronger through practice. Even if forgotten by many, it remains intact wherever it is realized. This perspective reframes the idea of decline in a crucial way. It is not a reason for despair or nostalgia. It is a reminder of fragility and responsibility. The Dharma is fragile because it depends on attention. It is resilient because attention can be restored at any moment. The Buddha's reflections invite neither alarm nor complacency, but steadiness. They ask for a kind of care that is not dramatic, not urgent, but consistent. In this sense, the most meaningful response to the predicted decline of the Dharma is not defense or preservation, but embodiment. To live with awareness, ethical sensitivity, and compassion is to keep the teaching alive in the only way that truly matters. Such living does not guarantee influence or recognition. It may pass unnoticed, but it carries forward the essential insight that suffering can be understood and released through clear seeing. The Buddha trusted this process deeply. He did not promise permanence. He did not promise triumph. He pointed instead to a path that remains available as long as human beings are willing to look honestly at their experience. Decline may shape the outer forms of the Dharma, but it cannot erase its possibility. That possibility renews itself each time someone chooses attention over distraction, humility over certainty, and understanding under comfort. To reflect on what the Buddha predicted about the decline of the Dharma is, in the end, to be brought back to a very ordinary and intimate question: how is this moment being met? The Buddha did not speak of decline to inspire fear about a distant future, nor to burden practitioners with the idea that something precious is slipping beyond recovery. He spoke from a clear-eyed understanding that whatever is alive depends on care, and whatever is neglected slowly fades. The Dharma is no exception, because it lives not in words or histories, but in the quality of attention brought to experience here and now. Seen this way, the decline of the Dharma is not a single event unfolding somewhere outside of us. It is a movement that can be felt in subtle ways whenever awareness becomes casual, whenever understanding is replaced by habit, and whenever comfort takes precedence over honesty. At the same time, renewal is just as close. It appears whenever someone pauses long enough to feel what is actually happening, whenever they choose to see rather than to escape, and whenever they allow insight to matter more than identity. There is something quietly reassuring in this. It means the future of the Dharma is not determined by eras or numbers, but by countless small moments of sincerity. It does not require dramatic gestures or public declarations. It asks only for a willingness to remain present with life as it is, including its uncertainty and its impermanence. In doing so, one participates in the continuity of the teaching without needing to claim it or defend it. If these reflections resonate, let them settle without urgency. The Dharma unfolds at its own pace, just as understanding does. This space exists simply to continue that unfolding together through careful listening, shared inquiry, and steady attention. You are welcome to return, to walk alongside these reflections, and to allow them to accompany you quietly wherever your own path may lead.